Welcome to our first Crown Jewel conversation of the new year. Shana Tova, wishing you a happy and a sweet new year. I'm Rachel Siegel, the Director of Strategic Programs at the Jewish Women's Foundation of New York. Thank you for joining us today from all over the world. The Jewish Women's Foundation of New York identifies and uplifts transformational women leaders. We call them jewels. Jewish entrepreneurial women, executives, and leaders, women who lead organizations and the field in addressing some of the most pressing issues in and beyond the Jewish community. Welcome back to our monthly Crown Jewel Conversation series, where we learn from and interact with these bold and creative leaders. We support visionary Jewish women leaders and visionary Jewish women philanthropists. When we say philanthropists, we're talking about those who give with intention, those who can give thousands of dollars and those who can give $25. Together, we are activating our potential to create positive change. We introduce women, like any of us on the screen, with leaders who are using their Jewish values and a gender lens to solve intractable problems anywhere in the world. We have created a space where those doing the work on the ground share the successes and challenges, and like-minded philanthropists, donors, activists, supporters of any kind, learn about issues relevant to their own desires to make a difference in the world. When you support JWF&Y, you support not only 40 organizations run by phenomenal women, you're supporting a movement. Our conversation today will allow you to get to know one of these incredible women in this movement. Karyn Grossman Gershon is the CEO of Project Kesher. Since 1994, she has organized Jewish women leadership training for over 6,000 women in Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Israel. Project Kesher's programs build intergenerational Jewish life, advance gender equality, and promote public health and wellness. PK-trained leaders are at the forefront of the struggle to improve rights, status, and quality of life for women and girls. PK invests in empowerment education, grassroots social activism, and pluralist Jewish innovation led by and for women and girls. Karyn is a member of the third cohort of the collective, JWF&Y's signature initiative, an active, ongoing community where visionary entrepreneurs and leaders collaborate and offer each other strategic support and advice. If, like Karyn, you believe in the power of feminist Jewish leadership, then you are in the right place today. After our conversation, we will open the floor for questions. Feel free to write your questions down in the chat or hold them and you'll have a chance to ask them later. For now, we've muted everyone to avoid background noise. And now I'm pleased to introduce the president of the Jewish Women's Foundation of New York, Rachel Weinstein.
Thank you, Rachel. Shana Tova to everyone. It's so amazing to see so many familiar faces and so many new faces. Feels like a long time since we've done one of these, and I'm thrilled to be kicking off our new season with Karyn. Love to welcome Karyn to join us.
Thank you so much.
And we have lost Karyn. Hello, there she is.
I'm
She's
here.
I'm gonna wait for Karyn. There we go. Hi, Karyn. Shana Tova, so great to see you.
Oh, great to see you too. Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you. We're, with the Ukraine in the headlines every single day, I know our listeners are really eager to hear from you about what's going on at the front, and I know you have a lot to share. Before we get there, I'd love to just take a step back, just so that you can share a little bit about your background. How did you come to leadership, and specifically, how did you become to this work in Eastern Europe?
So I was trained as a lawyer, and in the late 1980s, I met my soon-to-be best friend at Lamaze class, and she told me about a woman named Carol Kaplan, who, a woman named Sally Gratch, who was starting to organize a conference for Jewish women in Kiev. And I thought to myself, who are going to be those women who go to Kiev and do this really interesting thing? And at the time I was working 70 hours a week as a lawyer, and I thought, I got to go, because otherwise I think I will regret this my whole life. So not envisioning that I was eventually going to take over this organization, I called my mom and invited her to watch my children. And she informed me that she would be going with me. And before the end of that trip in 1994, I had become the head of Project Kesher, taking the mantle from the founder, Sally Gratch. And what I discovered is that all of the skills that I had as a lawyer could be put to very good use as an advocate on behalf of Jewish women and girls in this region of the world.
That's amazing. I mean, talk about a brave and sudden life change. And that's really exciting. And I'm thrilled that you did it with your mother, and the way you connected sounds so fascinating. I want to talk about the work of Project Kesher. I know you recently produced a video that really encapsulates all that you do, and I thought it might be useful just as a framework for our conversation to start there. So without further ado, I'll ask that we share the video.
For over 30 years, Project Kesher has been supporting an extensive grassroots network of Jewish women leaders in Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and Israel, as they advocate for the Jewish community, civil society, women's empowerment, health, and safety. This year, in honor of the 100th anniversary of the first bat mitzvah, Project Kesher women and girls in 5 countries became Banot Mitzvah.
25 years ago, when we would be in Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus, nobody there would be knowledgeable enough to actually run their own service. And this year, in each of the countries where we work, women were running their own services. And all of a sudden, we had people who could run these programs in these countries. And I think that that's really transformative change.
With war on the horizon, the women of Project Kesher learned to read Torah. They did not cancel their group bat mitzvah plans. These events inspired hope, joy, giving, and action.
Мне сложно говорить об ожиданиях, но я точно знаю, что жизнь будет подбрасывать свои уроки, и я всегда буду возвращаться в сегодня, в эту точку, чтобы понимать, что я должна действовать ответственно, но я, собственно, буду стараться это делать.
On February 24th, 2022, everything changed. The Project Kesher network began to mobilize immediately to support Ukrainian women and families surviving the war. With millions displaced, the daily work focused on humanitarian aid, evacuations, and food and medical supply delivery.
My choice was to stay here in Ukraine land, to stay with my family and with my husband. I have never expected that in my middle age, great age of my 40, my life story will have this terrible period of the war. We help women who decide to stay here and to operate in hot cities, for example, as Gershon. We also work with the women who should left their apartment and to move to a safety place in Western Ukraine or abroad. And that's why we help people with financial support. It's small grants from $100 to $500. I work hard with Ukrainian NGOs and European NGOs to protect women from trafficking in women, because there is some cases we faced and we know this, how to protect them.
Today, Project Kesher is supporting compassionate care and communication for Ukrainian women. Programs include a trauma-informed and gender-responsive SMS communication system, the creation and distribution of first aid rape kits, a podcast on Hromadsky Ukrainian Public Radio on mental health and reproductive health realities during the war. What can you do to support women and girls in Ukraine? Support Project Kesher. Donate now. Donate monthly. Share with your friends. Thank you for your support.
Can't hear you. Rachel, we can't hear you.
Sorry, I don't know why. So I said super, super powerful, super powerful. You've been working in Eastern Europe, as you said, and in Israel for decades now. So how would you have characterized the work of Project Kesher before the war began?
So Project Kesher was always envisioned as being a very empowering organization, not one that swooped in and basically told Jewish women and girls what Jewish life and what women's empowerment was going to look like in this region. For many, many years, we did all kinds of leadership training, really focusing on helping women identify their own needs and how to meet them. And so for many, many years, we did everything from pluralist Jewish educational programs to domestic violence training, anti-trafficking training, just a wide range of women's empowerment programming. But when the war started, everything just dramatically shifted. And we really were no longer able to just focus on creating leaders. We had to turn to the leaders we had created. And so we were really moved by how many of the women that we had trained decided to stay in country because they knew that they would be part of the backbone of humanitarian support and ongoing Jewish life in Ukraine. And so while those who are most vulnerable got out and we supported them in doing so, we have many, many women in place who continue to be at the forefront of their Jewish communities, distributing medical care, distributing food, making sure that people who do need to evacuate are assisted at every step of the process. Sometimes the biggest part of the evacuation process is convincing somebody that it's okay to go. And if they are sitting there with 2 children and an elderly parent, sometimes we have people who will call them 3, 4, 5 times and say to them, have you packed a suitcase? Do you have your important documents in it? Do you have money, the most money you can put together? And are you ready to go? So when you are ready, you will go. And I think that's what really distinguishes us as an organization is we know how women think. And sometimes it is the process that is the most daunting. And once it's underway, we can support them in the evacuation, but they have to emotionally move to the place where they're ready to go.
Yeah, and how would you say the war specifically has impacted women and girls? I mean, what are you seeing?
Well, war is fundamentally male focused because the vast majority of soldiers are male, and any society that is at war has to focus their resources and their energy on the men who are fighting. That isn't to say there aren't women soldiers, but they are still a minority. And so we really have focused on what we call a gendered response to the war. Women are really carrying a heavy load. They are carrying the load of their children, of the elderly family members. You know, they are living in a society where the infrastructure is being destroyed daily. That is a very critical piece of the Russian strategy. And so there are cities where, you know, there will not be heat this winter. The water is not coming in. So women are now not only responsible for their children, many of whom are not going to school, but they are responsible for basic survival of their families. So, you know, that is, I would say, the first and foremost issue is how do we support these women? And then depending on who the woman is, depends on what their issues are. For instance, we put up a notice one day that we had prenatal vitamins. 4,700 women responded in 1 hour. You know, we know that you need to take prenatal vitamins to avoid neurological and spinal defects. And yet, you know, they're no longer available. And the women are not only worried about their children, they're worrying that they are now failing as mothers. So here we have both the one level of we need to get these for the fetuses, But then the second level is the mental health of these mothers who feel that they are not doing their very, very best by their children. So we're looking at these from many perspectives. We're also very aware that things like hygiene supplies are not available, tampons, sanitary napkins. It's very easy to say, okay, they'll just do wash. They'll wash, they'll make whatever they need. The water system is so compromised that we are really leaving women in what is called like period poverty here. They can't get access to what they need. And it really undermines women's ability, not only to feel dignified, but to function in the world. So when we look at the war, we're looking to make sure that women and girls can function to the best of their ability. We think that it is no less important than making sure that the men in society are able to defend their country.
Yeah. And it's so interesting. And I was a little bit familiar with Project Kesher before the war in Ukraine, but I always thought that there was like a mirror between Project Kesher and JWFNY in a way that you identify leaders and you support the leaders to then deliver the services to make the change, which is so much about what we're about. You're doing it specifically in Eastern Europe and in Israel, and we're doing it all over the world. But there's this parallel between what our organizations are doing.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that one of the important things here is that, it is my job to help them raise as much money as we can to do their work. But for instance, I get daily solicitations to support work in Ukraine. All of those are vetted in Ukraine. The women in Ukraine know better than we do what they need. And so we are really focused on helping them make those decisions to the extent that they need assistance, they need more resources, they need help. Vetting organizations will help them. But at the end of the day, decisions for the work that we do are all made in country.
When we talked, you said something about how your investment in women leaders, like you've seen a positive return on that investment, and you shared with me some examples. Can you share some examples of how you've seen that positive return on investment?
Absolutely. Over the years, women leaders have emerged who are really, the ones who sit in the back of the room with a sparkle in their eye and then begin to emerge as the most dynamic leaders in your network. And so in 2 cases, we've sent our leaders for additional education. The executive director in Israel is now Rabbi Olya Weinstein. And when we met with her, she had started rabbinical school, but our team, including our board chair, Sheila Lambert, helped ensure that she completed her rabbinic degree. It's a very expensive process. And she has both a master's from the Schechter Institute and a rabbinic degree from HUC. In Ukraine, our emerging leader was 18 years old, Vlada Nyedek, when she joined us. And when we realized that she was in line to become the executive director, we sent her for an MBA at a university called Catholic Lviv University, which is one of the most prestigious in Ukraine, where she just completed her MBA from a bunker, where they brought them all together to accept their degrees. And when I said to Vlada, in the middle of a series of major bombs in her city, whether she thought she would finish on time, and she said, "You bet I'm going to finish on time." She said, "I need this degree, I need this relationship with these incredible people, and I need this credibility, and there's no time like the present." And so as we were gearing up all of our war efforts, at night, she was up another 3 hours completing her master's thesis, which she got done on time, because she's awesome. Yeah.
That's incredible. And I actually have chills to think about her finishing that from a bunker. You mentioned also that some of them were able to leverage relationships to do an SMS program with a cell phone company that has been very useful at this time. Can you talk a little bit about that?
One of the biggest problems of the war is the displacement of so many women. And as a result, there has been a very high incidence of trafficking in women. And the time that trafficking is most likely to occur is when women are crossing the border and there's so much uncertainty. And one of our leaders, actually Vlada Nyedek, was crossing the border one day, and she saw that her phone changed over to show the rate in the new country she had entered. And she thought to herself, I wonder if they could show other information. So she contacted Kyivstar, which is the largest mobile cell provider in Ukraine. And she said to them, could you also send them to Project Kesher so that we can give them like 5 steps to avoid being trafficked? You know, don't give your passport to anyone. Make sure that if you get in the car with somebody, you have proper identification. And Kyivstar said yes. So now when people are going to be moving between countries, they're directed to a Project Kesher website. So they get information on how to avoid trafficking, but also how to ensure that they will be able to apply for benefits in the countries where they land. So if they're in Bulgaria, how do you get your visa? How do you get your kid into school? What are the fundamentals? And then at the very end, the emergency call, which is to a Project Kesher contact in country who will come for you immediately if you really are struggling. So we've been really able to provide a level of support that we had never imagined we would be providing, because we now support Ukrainian women wherever they are.
What an invaluable resource, honestly, to protect women and their children at their most vulnerable moments. I mean, that's truly incredible. You're not only providing services to citizens on the ground in Ukraine, but also working with refugees who are arriving in Israel. How are you finding those refugees when they arrive, and how are you helping them to get settled in the new country?
Well, Project Kesher has a very extensive network. In fact, just since the war started, we've created a 5,000 woman database of the Ukrainian women in our sort of extended network who are in motion. And if women are interested in being in touch with us, we now add them to our database and stay in touch. So we actually know as women are entering Israel, in many cases, there's a lot of extended family in Israel. Israel, for better or for worse, is a wonderful place to go and also extremely expensive. So in many cases, people are going if they already have family there, and in many cases, this family is already affiliated with Project Kesher. And so we were able to set up arrangements with different municipalities like Petach Tikva, where we go in and we provide mental health support. Women sit in small circles. They talk about what they're experiencing, what their biggest issues are. We hand out gift cards to try to help, bridge a little bit of the gap between the benefits they're getting and their daily expenses. We help them take small tours. They go out with Project Kesher tour guides and they learn, like, this is the bank and this is where you get your cell phone SIM card, and this is where you register for your health benefits. And then we also have chosen to, I would say, adopt the LGBTQ community, because under Israeli law, there is no equal benefit for a non-Jewish LGBTQ partner. And so we have partnered with the Religious Action Center to bring a lawsuit to encourage Israel to help these non-Jewish partners find legitimate standing in Israel and hopefully be able to have a successful transition into Israeli life.
I think that's a wonderful example of how Project Kesher is not only providing the crisis services, but also this advocacy piece. What other advocacy initiatives are you undertaking?
Well, right now in Ukraine, there's a series of initiatives. I mean, every month we focus, and before the war, we always did breast cancer at this time of year. And so right now we're running a campaign that says, breast cancer doesn't wait for the war. And so there are opportunities for women to do some basic screening on their own. And if they have any reason for concern, we are constantly listing resources of where they can go for a mammogram still in Ukraine and for treatment. In some of the European countries, even if they can get benefits like healthcare, they can't often get them at the pace at which they need them. So if a woman is Ukrainian and makes her way into, let's say, Romania, and she is really struggling, we've put together, I always call it like a little push gate, like a small amount of money to try to get her into a healthcare practice faster. Because if she has to wait until she gets into the system officially, it may be a little too late in the breast cancer evaluation process. So we're trying to think of ways, in each place, like what can we do in Ukraine? What can we do in Europe? Actually, I connected with Jamie Lee Black on this, which was that we had a woman land in Spain and we had no programming there. And because of her relationship with Alex Borstein, who's I believe her cousin, we were able to refer somebody to another group in Spain. We really try very hard not to replicate programming where we go. So if another organization is there, we just try to assist, to make the referral and, if we have to put a small amount of money in, but we can't operate everywhere. But we try very hard to make sure that these health issues don't fall through the cracks.
Yeah, and we saw, even here in the US, how during COVID, these routine checks sort of went by the wayside. I can't imagine when you're in war and you don't have access to even the most basic resources, how you're keeping up with your medical visits. So to be able to provide those resources and support is really important. You also shared that you were in Washington recently, I believe, as part of a coalition to talk with our lawmakers about the situation in Ukraine. Tell us a little bit more about the coalition and those discussions.
About 10 years ago, I was introduced to a woman named Dora Komiak by Barbara Glickstein, who was my board chair. I think she's on this call today. And Dora has become the head of one of the major Ukrainian expat groups in the United States. And just to tell you how special Dora is, when there was an attack by Bobby Yar this past year, I was very blessed. It was Natan Sharansky and I that got quoted in the New York Times about the Bobby Yar situation. And 2 minutes later, when I hung up the phone, it was Dora Komiak who said, I want you to know that you are not Jews who are stranded in Ukraine. You are also Ukrainian Jews, and we stand with you. And I just sobbed, because that was not the history of Jews in Ukraine, but that is the history, that is like the situation of Jews in Ukraine now. Jews in Ukraine are at the forefront of leadership right now and of creating this volunteer infrastructure. So when Dora said to me, like 5 days before a conference in Ukraine, that they had thrown together a conference and there was no Jewish representation in DC, I thought, whatever I'm doing isn't as important as being in DC. So I joined this group. They thought they'd have 60 people, 270 showed up. Turns out there were quite a few Jews in the room, just not representing major Jewish institutions. And it turns out that there was a real opportunity to go to do something that's very unusual in Washington these days, talk to our leadership about something for which there is bipartisan support. There is an unusually high level of support for the Ukrainian people and for the war, because I do believe that people see this as one of the great fights for democracy, and it's taking place on the land in Ukraine. So after the conference, I committed to putting together a Jewish coalition of groups who are supporting Ukraine. I think we should be very proud as a Jewish community that there has been so much money raised for Ukraine. Groups like JFNA, the Jewish Federations of North America, and many others have really done an incredible job. The JDC, the Jewish Agency, but we haven't really paired that necessarily with an advocacy for the underlying situation and why we support them, because there's a moral imperative to support the Ukrainians right now in their battle. So I was very proud to be there, and now I'm working with the Conference of Jewish Presidents and some other groups to see if we can put together some kind of momentum, because I think in World War II, the Jews wondered where the world was. And now when we're facing a genocide, and an independent report just came out that this is a genocide, I think it's really critical that we are bearing witness and we are doing whatever we can on our part to support the people of Ukraine.
Yes, yes, indeed. You've been doing quite a bit of fundraising as well, isn't that right?
We have been doing a lot of fundraising, but I think that it's really important to note that in the first 3 months of the war, we raised more money than we ever had in our history in that short a time. And then by about June 1st, I called it almost philanthropic ADD. People were starting to really refocus. We have our November elections. We had the Dodds decision. There is so much going on in the world. And I think that my message to people would be is, it's not getting better in Ukraine. The situation is dire. I mean, we are literally like putting in purchase orders for blankets, for stoves, for food. This is going to be one of those moments in history that is just almost hard for the average person to wrap their arms around the level of disaster that's going to take place this winter. And so I think it's really critical that people understand that this is not something we can turn our backs on. I think we need to double down. We need to be supportive as they get through this war. And then on the other end, understand that there will be a seriously long period of reconstruction. Groups like the JDC, again, people are doing very important work there. But at this point, a lot of it is bare bones, like feeding the elderly. I mean, that is so essential. But the scope of need is so much larger than anything we've ever seen before. And so I feel like groups like Project Kesher, and there are many other smaller entrepreneurial groups that have emerged, have really done an amazing job and hit way above our weight class on these kinds of things.
Yeah, I think it's really important for people to hear you say that, because, we see these images on the news and we hear about it daily, and it's not, the end is not, unfortunately, in sight, and there isn't an opportunity to rebuild when the destruction's still happening. So how are these people to support their ongoing needs when they don't have the very basic infrastructure that you talked about, the clean water, food, access to education, all of these things? So I think it's really important for people to hear that.
I would tell you that one of the things that gives me incredible joy is, in the midst of all of this, I get these beautiful reports. For instance, this past month, a group of like 60 Ukrainian women asked if we would facilitate a Rosh Chodesh group online for them, wherever they were living in the world. And Cantor Vicky Glicken out of Dallas, who's from Ukraine, facilitated it. And the women just wrote in such glowing reports about what it meant to be able to gather in a Rosh Chodesh group, even online. And this month, they issued the first ever Ukrainian liturgy for Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. And people were very moved because after the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a movement to provide liturgy, but it was all in Russian. They no longer want to be in the language of the oppressor. They want to be in Ukrainian. And so we put that out. I got a report literally this morning, 6 communities that were given Torahs by Project Kesher because we wanted to make sure that women had access to Torahs. We've placed a total of 36, but during wartime, 6 of these communities have already committed to gathering for Simchat Torah in person, to dance together, to celebrate the holiday. And just this month, we arranged for a publisher of the first Ukrainian language Haggadah, which will come out in 2023 in time for this Passover. So what amazes me about the women I work with is they're focused on humanitarian, they're focused on mental health, and they're still not forgetting that so much of their comfort comes from being part of Jewish communal life, and they're there for each other. And these services and programs really are critical to them.
That's really beautiful. That's really beautiful. I want to remind our listeners, if you have questions, to please put them in the chat. I'm also going to open it up in a minute. I want to ask you one more question before I do that. You've had your community here at JWFNY as part of our 3rd cohort of the collective. And I'm just wondering, how has being part of that impacted your leadership, but also how have you leveraged the relationships that you've built with the other women in your cohort?
Well, first, I just want to do a shout out to the JWFN team, including Ruth Messenger and Jamie, who really have been advocates of mine when it was time to get out the message about what's going on in Ukraine, particularly from a women's perspective. One of some of my earliest phone calls were from the New York Jewish community to speak about what we were seeing and hearing, and I really appreciated that right off the bat. And then I would say, I have amazing classmates. We have an incredible cohort. I'll just give you 2 examples. One is I work with Esti Shushan, and a movie was made about her called Woman of Valor. And it was about the desire for Haredi women to be represented in the Knesset and the fight that they went through to have that representation. And Project Kesher translated that movie into Russian so that the women in our network in Israel could understand that they are not the only marginalized community. Sometimes people try to navigate their society only through their own marginalization. But by seeing Esti go through many of the same things that they did, they were really in a position to really understand that these women have more in common with them than they thought, and that they should be fighting not only for themselves, but all marginalized women in Israeli society. So that was, I would say, the first thing. I also had as my first chevruta, my first study partner, is Shoshana Keats Jaskell, and she heads Chokhmat Nashim, and she has just emerged as such a powerhouse, creating things like a photo bank of modern Orthodox women, with the idea that no woman in Israeli society should be erased because of this really non-halachic call for women's modesty to, remove all women from the public sphere. And Shoshana has done incredible work on this. Last year, Project Kesher put out a calendar for the first time showing Jewish women in watercolors represented in Ukrainian life. We think we may have been the first Ukrainian Jewish calendar. And this year, Shoshana did a gorgeous calendar using the images of the women through Chokhmat Nashim, where she showed there's no reason in halakha that Jewish women cannot be represented modestly in all spheres of Israeli society. So I feel that synergy with my cohort all the time, and I really feel very blessed. I think that's really been one of the most fabulous aspects of being in this cohort, has been just access to these incredible women.
Thank you. That's so amazing. I'd like to pause for any questions. You can put them in the chat, or if you would like to come on and ask yourself, at the bottom of your screen, there's a reactions button. And if you hit that, you can raise your hand and then we can see who'd like to speak. I just want to make that opportunity available. If not, I have lots more questions, but I want to make sure that we're answering what you most want to know. Oh, I see Barbara Pollard. If you could unmute and say hello.
How eloquent you are, Karyn. It's quite unbelievable for you to go after event that you've been doing prior to the war and after the war started. And I'm just so impressed. But I wanted to know what happens next. I know that no one can foresee the future, but I was wondering, number one, how the government in the US has made a commitment to you, and number two, what you plan on doing in Ukraine in the next coming months or years.
So I just want to back up for 1 second and just say, in a perfunctory way, that we continue to operate in Russia and Belarus, because it's very hard to say that these days. The Jewish community there has been almost decimated. We've been taking out as many men and boys as we can, and in some cases families, because it's not a safe place for them to be either. It's not necessarily a popular thing at this moment to say that you're helping Russians, particularly Russian Jews, but it is something that we continue to do. And in the US, I would say that regardless of your political affiliation, that we have done the right thing. I would just tell you that we made a commitment, a political commitment to Ukraine when they got rid of their nuclear warheads, to ensure that they would not be left abandoned. And so the support that we have been able to generate, both from the US and through the European community, from my perspective, is a sign of US morality. And I, for one, am quite proud that we are standing with Ukraine at this time. In terms of moving forward, Project Kesher has done something I think quite unique, which is we have incorporated 2 new nonprofits in Ukraine. A lot of the groups that are operating in Ukraine are doing so in a way that's almost like the wild, wild west. They're going in, they're throwing money at the situation. They have no experience there. They don't know what they're doing. And we have been very gently trying to reach out to each one of them when we can and just say to them, hey, we have 28 years of experience in Ukraine. And before you start providing programming for women and girls in this country, could we give you some guidance? Could we introduce you to great people? Could we introduce you to our trusted allies? And so I would say that almost half of our time these days is as like a broker, a trusted ally. You know, like there's a group called Razom I mentioned earlier, which is run by my friend Dora Komiak. When they wanted to send over medical supplies, I sent them to UGA Federation New York's Trusted Allies, a group called AFIA, a group out of California that Barbara Glickstein introduced me to called Direct Relief. They did not have to reinvent the wheel because Project Kesher we already had a wheel. So we were able to get them up to speed quickly. Moving forward, our incorporation in Ukraine did not provide for us to do widespread humanitarian relief. And so we have a new organization called the Women's Opportunity Fund that is allowed to do that. And so it'll partner now with Project Kesher Ukraine. And then we have this entity. And then we have a third entity, which is called a social entrepreneurship, which allows us to give women money directly. And so there's a lot of these groups doing like cash programs where they're handing out cash. It's wonderful. Let me not mince words. It's wonderful they're giving out cash, but they're not all completely legal in Ukraine. And so as an organization that plans to be in Ukraine now and 20 years from now, helping women and girls, we have put these structures in place. And in the next few months, we're hoping to move from outright cash support to investing in small businesses for women. That's going to be one of our highest priorities. We are already like the largest purchaser of a small company in Bucha. We had a woman who went back after her community was deoccupied, is what it's called. And she went back in and has been creating beeswax products. We just ordered like 1,000 of her lip glosses and her antiperspirants and her, you know, her face creams. And we're going to be giving those out this year. Even our Hanukkah, our Rosh Hashanah mailing this year had a challah cover that was done by 5 women-owned businesses in Ukraine. One created the fabric, one sewed the seams, one designed it, another printed it, and the other one shipped it. So we are trying very hard from our limited, because you got to keep in mind that we're still pretty small, but from our limited perspective, we're trying very hard to make all of these steps where we engage as many women as possible in opportunities that will enable them to have a better future.
I think that's so important, Karyn, the vetting piece, right? And then not recreating the wheel, right? There are so many philanthropists who want to help and to be able to know that their money's going to the right place and being used in the right way. And also, as it's so important to us at JWFNY is, investing in change, right? Yes, we have to feed people. People need to eat every day. But also, what are the things that we can invest in to help them grow and build back their society, right? And that sounds like what you're doing, which is so very important.
I'll add just one thing. Yesterday, we had a workshop about artificial intelligence. Ukraine is known for its tech sector. Everything there is being run with AI. And one of the people who contacted us said, AI can completely embed misogyny and all kinds of other problems into a society. Like when you are doing job recruiting, if a young guy who thinks that he is the best person ever in his job is the one who designs the chatbot, he will tell you that the very, very best person to take this job forever and into the future is somebody just like him. And so this woman from MIT came on to explain that AI is very useful, but it has to be used from a pluralist perspective to ensure that women's rights are not set back, but are advanced. And I think we had over, 70 people sign up in the middle of a war to learn about this. So
I think that's spot on, right? How do our biases carry over into everything that we create, and how do we keep those in check as we launch these new initiatives, technological or otherwise, 100%. Susan Beckerman, I invite you to unmute.
I would like also to do that. First of all, Karyn, it is wonderful to see you literally in the spotlight, which you so deserve, and you're never putting yourself forward. So I so admire you. I had to step out of the room for a moment, so if this is a repetition, forgive me. But could you comment about the connections between, among the other countries and the Project Kesher women in Russia, and what are they feeling on the ground there in the
Oh,
face?
Susan, that is the biggest heartbreak, I would say, of this whole war. Is there was a very long time where Russia, Ukraine, Belarus was a monolithic region, and the relationships between the women were so strong and so wonderful. And for whatever reason, I guess, as the war started, many of the women in Russia never believed Putin would attack, and they were a little bit harsh in their assessment of the potential for a war. And because of it, they became completely estranged from the women in Ukraine, who said, President Biden is saying that your troops are amassing on our borders, and when we are attacked, you will sit in your homes in Russia and we will die in the streets of Ukraine. And so I would tell you that the relationships are completely struggling right now. The women in Russia have come around, of course, because they saw reality, and they have been very appreciative as we've helped their sons and husbands get out of the country, because we would never abandon them. But we are really, really struggling. At this moment, when we did this AI workshop just yesterday, 2 women from Russia signed up. And the women from Ukraine said, we can't even allow them to attend. We will be suspect. We will be suspects simply by allowing them to participate in our program, and we can't allow that. It's too dangerous. We will be seen as traitors. So it's a devastating time. I want to thank Susan for being here today. One of the things that Susan does is she invests in a variety of cultural programs, and one of them was the movie 4 Winters, which Project Kesher co-sponsored for an evening in the city. And I think there's a way that arts and culture speak to people physically, that you physically embody, that is not just in your head. And we decided to do this because the movie, which is extraordinary, and if you haven't seen, I encourage you to go, talks about the story of the partisans, the Jewish partisans of World War II, and they tell their story in the first person. I am somebody who is not particularly comfortable with Holocaust movies. I wouldn't characterize this one as a traditional Holocaust movie because I laughed as much as I cried in this movie. The people were so real. But what was important to me, and the reason that I co-sponsored it for Project Kesher, is that the themes are so overlapping, it could break your heart. I'll just give one example. One of the partisans told the story of how the Americans started to arrive, and they knew they were there because they heard the planes flying overhead. And eventually they knew that maybe help was on the way and maybe it would be okay. When I was in Washington, D.C., I was talking to a series of young soldiers from Ukraine, and they said, when the HIMARS arrived, and every night you heard whoosh, whoosh, that was the first night they had 8 hours of sleep. And I thought, I have a lot of doubts sometimes about how I feel about being an American. We don't always make the best decisions. We have a lot of complicated policy decisions. Our government does not always run, but the way I'd like it to. But the morality of the wars that we have entered in Europe to save the Jews of World War II, and now to be there for the Ukrainians, when I saw this movie, I thought, we have to have the back of the people who are fighting for freedom, who are fighting for democracy.
Thanks for mentioning that film. And first of all, I hasten to add that my contribution was more connecting Julia with people who could really invest. But
you did that well.
I learned this morning, to my delight, that the film has been extended yet again, it was extended until tomorrow, and now it is extended for another week. So you have lots of opportunity and no excuse to miss it. And it really is spellbinding. And the story and these the people who are featured were teenagers when they went into the forest and spent 4 winters trying to survive and trying to deal with the fact that their families had been killed off in front of their eyes. But I recommend it highly, and thank you, Karyn, for supporting it in that way.
I think that one of the things that was so important here is they really focused on women's stories. And I think that for Project Kesher, as we look at this war, we see so many women who are heroines in the story of what's going on in Ukraine. There are Jewish women doctors who are like on the front lines in Ukraine, and that we are getting guidance from as to what we should purchase for, pregnant women, for women who are at risk in Ukraine. And we feel just so fortunate that we have, 28 years of these relationships so that they can give us their expert advice as they deoccupy a city. We get an immediate email or phone call, because we still get both, that says, this is what we need in Gershon. This is what we need in Mykolaiv. It's pretty incredible.
That's amazing. And for anyone who's interested, it was put in the chat, the trailer to the film, and it's playing at Film Forum, so you can check that out. Karyn, everyone who's listening, I'm sure is thinking, what can I do, right? This is the people who come to JWFNY, this is how we move through the world. We want to help. And what can we do?
Well, in addition to supporting Project Kesher, there are a variety of ways to help. The women who are landing in Europe, most of them will only be there for a year or two. And that's actually the case in the United States as well. Barbara asked about the US government, and I think that it was President Zelensky who asked that we not support a brain drain of Ukraine. So people will only probably have 1 or 2 years in the countries they're going to until hopefully they will be repatriated. Most of them need to speak English. So a woman who's landing in Bulgaria does not want to learn Bulgarian. She wants to use her high school English. So we are always looking for Americans who will partner like at least 1 hour a week with women all around the world who are displaced and who want to practice their English. We find that if they go to the supermarket in like Romania and say, I need a loaf of bread, they can function in a way that they can't in Russian or in Ukrainian or in, they certainly can't function in the local language. So that would be one of the things I would ask for. The next would be, I mentioned that we're going to do a 2023 Haggadah. And one of the things that we're going to do is ensure that women's voices are in this Haggadah. I've spoken to Rabbi Carol Balin, who wrote a book called The Jewish Women of Tsarist Russia. Well, it turns out that what we called Tsarist Russia was in fact also Ukraine, and we are going to be reclaiming some of those women. So for instance, the first diary ever written in Hebrew was a woman from Ukraine, and she writes about her Passover experience. So I would welcome any of you, if you have any family stories that you can document, that we might be able to take 2 or 3 lines and turn them into what I would call like these short little readings about memories of an Odessa Passover or a Kyiv Passover from a female perspective. It could be really interesting for us. It's going to be curated by a group out of Israel and Ukraine. We're using Why Is This Night Different by Noam Zion as sort of the base. And we're going to do it in the format that they've done it. Also pictures, if there are any fabulous pictures out of Ukraine celebrating Passover, we would really, really welcome them. And then finally, we, for the first time, I think, made it onto the radar screen this year. I think when organizations were looking at who had credibility in Ukraine, they realized that we've been there this whole time. And so to the extent that you're familiar, like with family foundations and other organizations that should know about us, please make the introduction. Likewise, I think Randy Gurian was on this call today as well. Because Randy decided to do an event at her synagogue in Chicago, we made that video because we couldn't be everywhere and we couldn't do everything. But if you have a book group or a synagogue group and they would like to know just a little bit about what's going on, this is a way to do it, because we're only a staff of like 3.5 in the US and we can't be everywhere, but you can be. So if this is interesting or meaningful to you, we encourage you to be out there letting people know this isn't over and you can be part of the advocacy for the women and girls of Ukraine.
Thank you, Karyn. We're really proud of the networks that we can build at JWFNY. And it's not only in and amongst you leaders who sit in our collective, but it's really about that intersection between philanthropists and not-for-profit leaders, all who have that same goal of, social change, humanitarian aid, improving the world. And so that's the best possible thing that I think comes out of the relationships here at JWFNY, and I hope people will take it to heart. We'll certainly share Karyn's details and some of these action items with you as a follow-up after. But Karyn, thank you for being here today. It was such a pleasure talking with you.
Thank you so much.
Yes, so well said. Thank you so much, Karyn, for taking the time to share your wisdom and your extraordinary story and experience with us, and also personally hearing about your participation and the relationships you've made in the collective. And thank you, as always, Rachel, for leading us through this conversation. We don't have to hope that things will be different when we have leaders like you to guide us, Karyn. In the United States and all over the world, we actually believe that change will happen. We're so inspired by Karyn's leadership and extraordinary story, and we hope that you are as well. If you've been with us before, like Rachel said, we'll send you tomorrow some action items that you can take. We offer these sessions at no cost to you, but if you find value in what we're doing, we hope you'll consider 2 donations, one to Project Kesher and one to JWFNY. If you enjoyed our conversation today and want to hear more from incredible Jewish women leaders like Karyn, we hope you will join us in person and online at our annual convening on November 3rd. This event today is just a taste of what you'll see at the convening. And Karyn will be there to answer any additional questions that we didn't have time for today, as well as 39 of our other jewels who are doing incredible work as well. We're putting a link in the chat and we'll send out more information tomorrow about how you can join us. The convening will highlight 3 issues that we believe are of interest this year, including global humanitarian crises and refugees, gun violence, and reproductive justice. We also will be sharing a large surprise with you there. You won't want to miss it. If you're interested in having the opportunity to select which inspirational leaders will join our next cohort of the collective, we hope that you'll consider joining a visionary circle. There you will learn about participatory grant making and grow in your philanthropic education, as well as learn about other incredible women leaders like Karyn. Our circles start next month, so please contact Eva Stern for more information. Thank you all for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing you soon.